This is the first time in my experience where we have more money than we know what to spend it on.
Welcome back to Square Off. As they say, more money, more problems. Republicans in the legislature are squabbling over how to spend a $5 billion surplus in the next state budget. Republican State Senator Paul Boyer of Glendale, whom you just heard, wants at least $850 million in new money for schools. His fellow Republican Senator, Michelle Ugenti-Rita of Scottsdale, doesn't. And in a Senate and House where Republicans have just a one-vote majority, every vote counts. So how does a deal get done, and where will the money be spent? I'm joined by our political insiders, Chad Campbell, a senior VP at the consulting firm Strategies 360. Campbell is a former Democratic leader of the Arizona House. And Marcus Dell'Artino, he's a partner at First Strategic Communications and Public Affairs and a member of the John McCain Staff Alumni Club. Welcome back to Square Off to both of you.
Great to be here in person.
Yeah, it is, eh? Enough with this Zoom. We're done. There's talk of more money for schools, a tax cut, larger tax cut, massive school voucher expansion, something about water. We just heard Tom Bishotsky talking about his wish list. Marcus, I'll start with you. Where do things stand on the state budget priorities, at least right now?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that won't happen, and there's been some discussion about a skinny budget, which means we'll just do last year's budget and go home. That doesn't take into account the governor's priorities, so I can virtually assure you that that would get vetoed relatively quickly. And so now we got to get to the negotiating table, take that strategy off the table and get to where the rubber meets the road. There's going to have to be some money at schools. We're just going to have to negotiate the amount. We're about 2006 levels. That doesn't take into account 16 years. We have inflation. You can't find bus drivers. I mean, where do you want to go on this? So schools are going to have to get some money in here. And of course, there'll be some negotiation about a tax cut. And I think the real key here is ESAs. That's the discussion we're going to have.
The school vouchers.
Yes, sir.
You think that could be the big holdup?
I think there's going to be a discussion of whether we expand vouchers full on for every child in Arizona, or we target those ESAs to lower income students.
And you mentioned the governor's priorities. What are they?
Certainly water, and I think, you know, for all of us here who just heard what Tom just said, it's a startling moment, and that is a significant amount of money that the governor's looking at putting into water, $1 billion for his program.
And what about the tax cut? There's talk you want to go back to the tax cut because there's a referral on the ballot, and there's kind of a game of chicken going on between the people who might refer another a change?
Absolutely, that's part of the strategy here too. We've got, you know, 208's been pretty much settled here that it's not constitutional. That means there's a lot of extra money in the coffers. Does that money go to tax cuts? How do you frame that so it doesn't end up with another ballot referral?
Chad, I'll go to you. How does all this money, a record $5 billion surplus, how does that complicate things? There's so much money and many ways to spend it.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it is said that it's a harder budget year when you have extra money versus when you don't have enough money. And that's because you have members down there who all have priorities. And the one, I think the most prominent one this year is Senator Paul Boyer, as you talked about. And when you have these members, when you have a small vote margin, like you said with the Republicans, you have one or two members that are going to hold the line, hold out for their priorities. It just stalls that budget process. You know, the interesting question is, will the Republicans come to the Democrats at some point? That's going to be the wild card right there. I doubt it, but they may have to if the Republicans can't get their caucus in order.
Seriously?
Well,
you really? Karen Fann has talked about that. Given what she said about Paul Boyer over the last year or more.
I said I doubt it, but the wild card is, can they pick off one or two Democrats? It wouldn't be a lot of Democrats. Can they just pick off one or two Democrats? That is a strategy they've tried in the past. So it's up to that leadership in both the House and the Senate on the Democratic side to keep their caucus together. And that's not, it's easier said than done sometimes, let's put it that way. If the governor comes to a member and dangles $100 million for a pet project in their district, it may be enticing to that member.
And that's an interesting question, right? The courts struck down ballot stuffing. Yeah. You can't trade votes on the budget by putting things that are not budget related into the budget. Marcus, how is that affecting what's going on when it comes to who has the leverage here?
It makes your negotiating a lot harder, I'll tell you that. And it also means that you have to get some of these bills through the process before you can actually come to a negotiation, because those members want their bills to go up to the governor's desk and want them signed. So you're going to have to start moving some of these bills that you may not necessarily wanted to move beforehand to negotiate.
And it's also an election year.
Yeah,
Right?
that little thing is happening as well, right?
And how does that complicate what the members want to do and, again, the leverage you might have by threatening to just keep them there as long as it takes?
And again, I mean, you talked about Senator Ugenti Rita, who's running for higher office right now, and she's going to try to be placating her base. So she's going to be looking at doing some of those high-profile things, like opposing more K-12 funding, because she's opposed the teachers union in the past. You have Udall in the House running for superintendent of public instruction. So maybe trying to broker a deal on education funding would benefit her. Once you have that election year component added into the budget process, it makes it exponentially more complicated.
And are there any other wild cards in either the House or the Senate who might have an outsized role to play in this budget?
I would obviously Paul Boyer, Senator, is somebody to keep an eye on. I'd say Sean Bowie is somebody to keep an eye on. The House gets a little tougher. And I'm not too sure where you would go shopping for votes actually over there. And I would also say, you know, having watched this process happen for just a few years, you got to watch your costs. You might negotiate a more expensive budget by reaching out to some of those people rather than dealing with your own members.
Even with a $5 billion surplus?
Even with the $5 billion surplus.
Okay, so last question for you guys. What gets left in? What gets left out? Chad?
I mean, ultimately, education funding is going to be in there. There will be some kind of tax cut because the governor will not sign anything without a tax cut. This is his last term. He wants this to be a legacy budget. But I think education funding will be there. I think tax cut will be there.
I think the thing that's going to hold this up probably the most, and I agree with you on everything, but I think it's going to be water.
Water, really?
Yeah, I think that will be the one that holds it up.
Wow. After all we just heard.
It's $1 billion. $1 billion with a B
point.
in the most complicated subject matter possible.